The Hebrew Bible, like any text, is influenced by history and developed in history. How the Hebrew Bible is communicated is important for its development. I argue that orality and textuality play together to develop the Hebrew Bible we know today. Hi, my name is Brenna Salverson. I am a double major in Writing Linguistics and Philosophy with a concentration in Religious Studies. Today I'm presenting a religious studies topic with the mentoring of Dr. Pioske. I've looked into this topic through a case study of Deuteronomy texts, specifically chapters 5, 6, and 27. Please scan the QR code or click the link to access and read these texts. Of course, you may Google these passages and get plenty of results as well. Let's jump in with the orality aspect, starting with a definition of sorts. Of course, like most things in this presentation, it is debated what exactly orality is and how it was practiced in ancient Israel. Orality is ultimately the transmission of traditions through verbal performances. So you spoke and performed to a crowd to pass along history and traditions. We must juxtapose orality with literacy. Could these people read and write, and how does that impact the interplay of orality and textuality? Literacy is a complicated topic itself. I'm going to define it in a simplified version that is quite debated. According to Rolston, literacy is the ability to read and write using and understanding a standard script, a standard orthography, a standard numeric system, conventional formatting and terminology, and with minimal errors of composition or comprehension. Of course, there are people who could do basics of this standard, maybe sign their name or write the alphabet, but I want to use this definition to point out the complexities of literacy. We are a highly literate culture who can't quite grasp not being able to or needing to read or write. With the difficulty of being literate, we also have this idea of who needs literacy. Agriculturists, pastoralists, artisans, among others, didn't need to read or write to live. Your job took up your whole day. There wasn't much leisure time. You certainly didn't have time to learn to read and write as Rolston outlines. Just put the plow in the dirt. You just needed to have the skills for your job. As a result, I think we can recognize that ancient Israel had a low literacy rate. This highlights that in ancient Israel, orality was the predominant method. So stories were developed in an oral form and passed along. These stories include those we find in the Hebrew Bible. And we see this orality reflected in the written text. Deuteronomy exemplifies orality in a few ways. The first of which is the framing of these passages as speeches. In chapter 5, we go back to the first verse to get a sense of where verse 22 is coming from and see that Moses convened all Israel and said to them. He didn't read to them, or write to them, or hand out pamphlets. He said to them. Chapter 6 says, "Hear therefore, O Israel." Calling on the audience to hear, to listen, indicates a speaker. It pulls on an oral tradition because they aren't told to read or to look, but to hear. Chapter 27 says, "Then Moses and the elders of Israel charged all the people as follows." Moses is again speaking, demanding, commanding. It seems that these passages are reflecting an oral tradition through the use of speech. Another aspect is the use of second person in contrast to the established third person. As discussed previously, the writer poses Moses as speaking, which is in third person, and yet Moses speaks using second person. We see this in chapter 5 when Moses says, "To your whole assembly." Again in chapter 6 with "you shall love." Chapter 27 with "you shall set up." The writer could have chosen to write the whole thing in third person. For example, Moses said to the Israelites to do X, Y, and Z. And yet the writer chose to position Moses as speaking to you. This use of "you" recalls a speaker talking to a crowd. Moses isn't telling a distant story. He's addressing a group of listeners and pulling them in. Perhaps more importantly, it pulls you in as well. It breaks the divide of time and positions Moses next to us as current day readers, or pulls you into the past. In both scenarios, we are listening to what he has to say. which feels awful like an oral tradition. So the text is reflecting the oral tradition of ancient Israel. Now, you're probably like, Brenna, you're missing a huge aspect. These are oral characteristics, sure, but they're in a written text. And you know what? You're absolutely right. Not to mention the use of textuality in the passages themselves. Written elements are rife. In chapter 5, God wrote the laws on stone tablets. Chapter 6 says that people wrote them on their doorposts and gates. Chapter 27 says Israel shall write on the stones. There's a heavy sense of textuality in all this orality. Why would the Hebrew Bible, which was written during a time of orality dominance, include references to textuality? So let's check out how these two are embedded together in the Deuteronomy texts. If you read closely, a pattern reveals itself. Speech and writing are mentioned in a specific order in all three passages. In chapter 5, verse 22 starts with, "The Lord spoke with a loud voice." Later on, the Lord wrote the laws. We have this progression from speech to writing. We see it again in chapter 6. "Hear therefore, O Israel," proceeds writing the laws on doorposts and gates, not to mention reciting to the children. So orality seems to beget textuality. Chapter 27 follows this pattern too. Moses charges the people in the sense of giving a spoken command to write laws on the stones. The pattern of orality to textuality is pretty clear and seems to reflect an oral tradition. Between the three passages, we see that orality precedes textuality. I believe that this reflects the process of the time. I argue that in ancient Israel, stories were transmitted orally, since orality was king, before being written down. Furthermore, this showcases that the writing of the Hebrew Bible is based on and reflects an oral tradition. Stuart Weeks puts this quite eloquently. Oral cultures do not sit around aspiring to create such works until the technology arrives to permit them. Writing textuality is not needed to pass along traditions. Stories still form and develop in an oral tradition. Thus, we can assert that the Hebrew Bible is deeply rooted in an oral tradition, and it shows in the written text. However, I want to complicate this more. Right now, we are looking at a relatively linear model. But Robert Miller II says that writing often supports oral tradition and vice versa. That vice versa can be hard to swallow, especially with what I've showcased, but let's check it out. Orality and textuality did play together, and not just in a linear format. Literacy was still low, as we discussed earlier. Even when documents were written down, people couldn't read them. So those who were literate had to perform them to their peers. That certainly disrupts our linear format. Carr also mentions that the texts were not intended to be read. They were meant to be memorizing devices, so the story could be orally performed. Lastly, Miller argued that textuality and orality begat more history, stories, and traditions. Even as these were written, they were discussed by illiterates, retold again and again until a new story is written down. So overall, the Hebrew Bible was developed through the interplay of textuality and orality. This is critical to how we study and understand the Hebrew Bible. We can't divorce it from its historical context or how it was historically created, because these stories changed and shifted between orality and textuality. There were different versions developed. We can't necessarily take one line and hang the moon on it, because it might not have been there in the first place, or maybe it had a different version at earlier times. Of course, that gets into a discussion of what Hebrew Bible text then is authoritative, but that's a discussion for another time. Thanks for coming to my presentation. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer them to the best of my abilities.